Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you for joining us for the first Newport Lecture Series presentation of the 2020-2021 academic year. I am George Lang, CEO of the Naval War College Foundation, and I want to thank our trustees, members, friends, and benefactors for their wonderful support for the missions of the Naval War College and Naval War College Foundation. And a special thank you to our dear friends at the Pritzker Military Foundation on behalf of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, who have provided generous support to the Foundation for this lecture series. This is an event we typically host monthly during the academic year at the Naval Station Newport Officers Club, usually preceded by a 30-minute reception with light refreshments. But obviously in this COVID environment, and we only find ourselves operating, we are bringing this presentation and many others hosted by the Foundation to you virtually. A significant benefit of this approach, of course, is we can interact with a much larger audience that doesn't have to travel to Newport to attend presentation by the college's renowned faculty. I'm told tonight's audience exceeds well over 100, actually 150 plus guests. This is a special day for the Foundation, not only because it's our first lecture of the season and we have Dr. David Kohnen with us, but it's a day that we officially reveal the Foundation's new logo, word mark, and tagline, Educate Today, Secure Tomorrow. We engaged in a rebranding project about 1 year ago, just before we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Foundation, to refresh how we communicate with our constituents and represent the modern day partnership that exists between the Naval War College Foundation and the Naval War College. And the new logo and tagline are just some of the immediate results of this effort over the last year. We hope that you like them. Now, to introduce your guest speaker this evening, Dr. David Kohnen is the Naval War College's director of the John B. Hattendorf Center for Maritime Historical Research and a retired commander in the United States Navy. David earned his PhD from the University of London King's College in War Studies, Maritime and Naval History, an MA from the Naval War College in National Security and Strategic Studies, an MA from Old Dominion University in History, and a BA in History from the University of Iowa. As a director of the Hattendorf Center, he's responsible for fostering academic partnerships among maritime historians worldwide and for educating practitioners and the public through the conduct of original documentary research on the influence of history upon sea power. He is considered an expert in many areas, including civil affairs, international relations, maritime history, maritime strategy, and maritime planning. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, please give a warm virtual welcome to Dr. David Kohnen.
Well, thank you, George. It's such a pleasure for me to be here tonight, and truly it's an honor for me to be able to share some of this rich history with this great audience. And tonight I'd like to talk to you about something that happened 100 years ago that I think is relevant even to this day, and that is how people were able to harness changes in technology in such a way that they were able to create new doctrine at a time when the doctrine didn't exist, and apply that doctrine in the heat of conflict, war, or operations other than war. And tonight, we're going to be meeting some personalities who have ships that are named after them, but we're going to be meeting them at a very early age. So without lingering too long on the title slide, the trick question of the night will be for somebody to figure out what the title slide is showing us. And I think the answer to that question will make itself apparent in the context of the presentation tonight. What we're looking at is a century ago, at the dawn of the 20th century, is a radical transitional time in technology. We had already seen a transition from sail to steam and from wooden ships to steel ships. But then at the dawn of the 20th century, these young junior officers in the United States Navy were witnessing another major technological revolution in the global maritime stage. And those two individuals were none other than Ernest J. King, who is to the right on the slide, lieutenant, and past midshipman Chester W. Nimitz. Both of them came together for the first time in Annapolis on the grounds of the Naval Academy, on the yard. Lieutenant King was just returning from the Asiatic fleet, where he saw the last remnants of the Russian fleet coming into Chinese ports after the Battle of Tsushima. Chester Nimitz just graduated from the Naval Academy. He's a past midshipman, and he's waiting for orders to a battleship when he runs into Lieutenant King. And King said, "Why are you waiting around for orders? There's a submarine down by the pier. Go down there and sign on to that submarine. You'll find tremendous opportunity in the submarine force." So past midshipman Nimitz went down and volunteered for submarine duty. And that's the beginning of a long story in Nimitz's life. But of course, Ernest King later on is going to be his boss within the context of the Second World War. And so tonight I'll be talking a little bit about how the Navy transition from coal to oil influenced the careers and the personalities of these two young, fine naval officers at the dawn of the 20th century, both of who would go on to earn 5-star rank within the ranks of the United States Navy into the Second World War and beyond. So when they were younger, at the dawn of the 20th century, President Theodore Roosevelt issued a proclamation called the Roosevelt Corollary. And the Roosevelt Corollary was basically the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which basically in 1823, President Monroe said to all the European empires, please stay out of the Americas. On the other hand, we still defend our right to defend our interests worldwide. Roosevelt went a little bit farther because Alfred Thayer Mahan was writing that book about American sea power. And he said, we're going to go further than just defend the Americas. We're going to defend our interests with a Navy that's capable of global operations. And the Roosevelt Corollary laid the groundwork for that strategy. And of course, the cruise of the Great White Fleet demonstrated the new American Navy on the global stage. The problem is that was a coal-fired fleet. And we did not have coaling stations worldwide to refuel these ships when they did the great cruise around the world. And there were so many technical problems that nobody really talks about with the Great White Fleet. Among other things, they had to go to British ports and French ports and buy coal in order to refuel those ships. And of course, that's a great vulnerability in the event that one of our ships would be coming under attack. And that was something that the United States Navy recognized as a result of experimenting with global cruises. They recognized that they were vulnerable to other naval powers. Of course, the other problem with coal is it's hard to deal with, especially at sea. Here we see a picture of a coaling operation. The ship is approaching the Cyclops, which later, of course, disappeared without a trace in the Bermuda Triangle. And the Cyclops was one of the colliers that the U.S. Navy used to keep their ships running on the global commons. And the coaling operations with these colliers was really cumbersome, especially at sea. As you can see, there's these big scoops where they would drop coal right onto the deck. And the sailors, of course, who just probably spent the day scrubbing those decks to make them clean, are now shoveling coal down the chutes and into the holds, where they're going to have to also shove the coal into the boilers. Now, one of our alumni and a former two-time president of Naval War College, Alfred Thayer Mahan, said, oil is a much easier thing to deal with at sea. And so he started writing about the potential of oil to fire the ships of the United States Navy. And one of the articles that he wrote, which is very interesting, at the dawn of the 20th century, is the Persian Gulf and international relations. I've highlighted from page 39 of that article. He says, the Middle East, if I may, adopt a phrase that I have not seen before. What Mahan just did with that article is he created the phrase Middle East. And that comes out of the studies that were being conducted at the Naval War College of the global maritime arena. And one of the things that Mahan says is that in the Middle East is this vast, unregulated area where oil is available to all. And if we are able to tap into those oil sources, we can gain an advantage. In addition, the United States has a rich oil reserve of its own. And so at the dawn of the 20th century, naval thinkers like Mahan are starting to say it's time for us to transition from coal to oil. Now, we can all imagine what the coal companies thought of this idea. But at the same time, people like Theodore Roosevelt, talking to his aide for gunnery and naval operations, William S. Sims, commander, he says to Sims, what do you think of this oil idea? And Sims said, I think it's the right thing to do because my friend John Jellicoe over in England is telling me about a new ship that the British are building, which is coal-fired. However, it also has the capability of transitioning to oil. So the idea, the big debate that was happening at the dawn of the 20th century is, do you stick with coal, something you know how to use, or do you transition to oil? And so what Teddy Roosevelt said to Commander Sims is go ahead and take command of the Minnesota and go do some gunnery exercises in the North Sea with the British and, have a talk with your friend Jellicoe. And that's exactly what Sims did. He met with John Jellicoe, who's the gentleman at the center of the picture. And at Christmas time, Jellicoe took him down to see the battleship Dreadnought. And what Sims found on board the Dreadnought shocked him because, number one, it was a completely radically new design in warship, but it was also demonstrating what the capacity would be in the future. And so by seeing the Dreadnought, Sims came home and said to President Roosevelt, we really need to switch to oil because that will give us the global strategic advantage. And if we are able to build a fleet of oil-fired battleships, we're going to basically render all the fleets of the world secondary to the American fleet. So that sparked a big debate within the ranks of the United States Navy. And also, one of the things that Sims did when he was overseas, he talked about getting a maritime alliance together with the British Empire. Mind you, just a century before, right, a guy named George Washington said, we're going to leave the British Empire. Commander Sims went to London and said at a party held at Guildhall that if ever an enemy threatens the British Empire, you can count on your American brethren across the sea to defend that empire. And that made the New York Times. That speech was called the Guildhall speech, but it was referred to in the New York Times, as you can see from the headline, as the, quote, love feast between the British Empire and the United States. So what you have is a lot of interesting things happening at the dawn of the 20th century. Not only are you seeing the transition technologically from coal to oil, but you're also seeing the burgeoning reunification of American and British naval power after the Guildhall speech of 1910. And a lot of those decisions were getting made at the same time that these young junior officers within the ranks, Lieutenant King and now Lieutenant Nimitz, are also playing around with new technologies like wireless communications. Just the month after the Titanic sank, Ernest King and Chester Nimitz conducted a series of experiments that included the first wireless transmission from a submarine to a surface ship, and then a relay transmission from a surface ship to an aircraft. That was the first time that had ever happened. And it was Ernest King and Chester Nimitz who made that experiment happen in June of 1912, just a month or so after the Titanic sank. So what we see here is a very interesting sort of picture of American sea power coming together after Alfred Thayer Mahan writes that famous book at the Naval War College, looking outward and seeing how American sea power can be brought to bear. Now, the United States is also claiming control in the Americas. And at the time that they were doing those experiments, they were also building the Panama Canal. So with the construction of the Panama Canal, you're seeing the ability of the United States Navy to transition between two oceans at once, which is another tremendous advantage. And those coal-fired ships are being augmented by aircraft. And the Panama Canal became a very important strategic feature in the American strategy. So when the European powers were threatening the Panama Canal at Vera, we sent a contingent of U.S. naval forces down to defend those waters. And that became the first time that air power was used in combat operations off Veracruz, Mexico. And among other folks who are there at the time are Ernest King, Bill Halsey. That's actually a picture of Harold Stark that didn't transition to the slide very well. And they're all down there experimenting in smaller boats with oil-fired ships. And this technology enables these ships to operate on the high seas and remain operational without having to pull into port or coal at sea, just by transferring the oil. And it's Ernest King who does the first oil transfer in combat operations off Veracruz on board one of these small destroyers, what they called destroyers back then. They all come back together as part of the destroyer flotilla under Admiral Sims, future Admiral Sims. And the people who are part of that flotilla operating right here in Newport are people like Harold Stark, Halsey, Ernest King, and Sims. And these guys are all oil-fired naval officers who are running against the prevailing winds of the fleet at the time. And they're saying that the future is oil. There's a big debate happening at the time within the Navy about this transition to oil. And so the first ship that was built as an oil-fired battleship is the Nevada, and Sims gets the job to command the Nevada. So what you see is that the smaller vessels serving as the prototypes for the bigger construction ships, and it's oil that fires these warships. The Nevada, being the first oil-fired ship, is a complete disaster. It's very hard to operate because nobody knows how to operate these oil-fired battleships very well. And so Sims gets that job to figure out how to do it. Now, round about the same time that Sims is firing up that oil-fired battleship, a German submarine pulled into Newport. And this is 1916 now. It says 17, but it's actually 1916. And the German U-boat U-53 pays a call to the Naval War College. This is a direct threat against the United States. What the Germans are doing is they're saying, we can reach American shores. So it's best for the United States Navy to remain neutral in the First World War. So the First World War begins in Europe in 1914. 1916, this German submarine came to the Naval War College. The skipper, Hans Rosa, actually introduced himself to the president. You can see the president's aide actually shaking hands on board the submarine, U-53. And when the U-53 went back out to sea, they sank a number of ships right in the Narragansett Bay. And that was meant to be a signal from Germany to the United States Navy that it's best to stay out of the First World War. Now, that is a precursor operation to ultimately the decision of President Wilson to declare war on Germany. And when we declared war on Germany in 1917, the Europeans had already been at war for a number of years, and that war was a technological nightmare. You have aerial bombing of cities of London with Zeppelins. You have gas on the Western Front. And of course, German U-boats are targeting merchant vessels on the high seas, and they're laying carnage on the high seas. Now, from an American point of view, this is a piratical activity that is running against all rules of humanity. And of course, when the United States joins this European war, the United States is really breaking from that tradition that George Washington set of staying out of foreign entanglements. And so when Wilson declares war in April of 1917, the United States Navy really doesn't have an organization that knows how to do that type of operation in foreign waters. And none other than Admiral Sims is sent over to Europe to command U.S. naval forces in Europe. But nobody told the Atlantic Fleet commander, Admiral Mayo, who's in the lower right-hand side. What was happening is the brand new Chief of Naval Operations, the first Chief of Naval Operations, was also trying to figure out how to do his job. And without consulting with Admiral Mayo, they sent Sims over to command U.S. naval forces in Europe. and they didn't have a procedure for it. Among the first things that Sims asked for are the destroyers from the Atlantic Fleet. So Sims has that experience with the destroyer flotilla, the previous experience, and the first thing he needs are those destroyers in European waters. But there was no procedure to get them there, and the destroyers really didn't have the range to be able to just sail to Europe without refueling. The first group of 5 destroyers did get there without refueling, but Joe Tausig, the skipper who led those destroyers to European waters, basically said they were running out of gas at such a rate that they were worried that they would have to set sail in order to reach European waters. And so there was an immediate signal back from Admiral Sims from Europe saying, we need to get more destroyers, but we need to figure out a way to support their voyage from the United States to European waters. And so that mission fell to none other than Lieutenant Commander Ernest J. King, who's on the right-hand side. And his job at the time was working for Admiral Mayo, who I introduced earlier, as the fleet engineer of the Atlantic Fleet. The gentleman to the left, of course, is Chester W. Nimitz. And at the time, he was a lieutenant. He's depicted there as a commander. And what King ended up doing is he contacted Chester Nimitz and he said, look, you're the executive officer on the USS Maumee, the first oil refueling ship that was built by the United States Navy. And we need you to get to Atlantic waters. At the time, they were down in Galveston. And Nimitz and his skipper, George Dinger, this guy to the left, got to Boston, and Ernest King met Dinger and Nimitz and this other lieutenant in the middle, Glenn Davis. And they came up with a procedure for refueling warships at sea side by side, which is much quicker. Now, a side story, Chester Nimitz was one of the lead engineers who knew about diesel power. And in the construction of the USS Maumee, he was demonstrating a diesel engine. And when he was demonstrating that technology, he accidentally stuck his finger in the engine. And as a result, he lost his finger. And the only thing that actually saved his finger was his Naval Academy ring. And it was during the construction of that ship, the Maumee, where he was the XO on board, that he lost his finger. Now, in the context of 1917, this is actually the drawing that Ernest King came up with to show how you could do side-by-side refueling. And this idea came out of that experience of Vera Cruz that I mentioned earlier. At Vera Cruz, they were doing refueling operations with oil, but they were doing it with the old Chinese landing method. So in other words, you'd pull your ship up behind the refueling ship, and they would string a refueling line to the ship in trail. And the problem with that method is you have to maintain pretty good station keeping in order to avoid a collision. So one of the things that King came up with was this idea of doing side-by-side refueling, and he worked it out with Nimitz and Davis. And this is actually the drawing for those Maumee operations of 1917. They ended up refueling 35 destroyers that were en route to European waters between May and July of 1917. And that's the first time in combat history that side-by-side refueling was conducted in any Navy of the world. So what we see are the sinews of future tactics, techniques, and procedures that would have to be developed in the future. But right now, the young officers who were charged with this mission are really making it up as they go. And it's a great credit to the United States Navy, really, to provide a forum for creative thinkers at a younger rank and experience level to be able to come up with these ideas without going through, some oversight to do it in the first instance. And you can see how dangerous these operations were. This is actually a picture of the Paulding pulling up alongside USS Maumee on the 28th of May, 1917. And this was the big secret. During the early experiments with side-by-side refueling, they discovered that the fuel line would crimp up. And so the way to deal with that is to have this mechanism, a saddle. And it was Glenn Davis who came up with this idea, very simple idea. And what it did is it enabled the refueling to take place without crimping up the line. So this a simple solution like a wooden saddle is the secret to refueling operations. And this is truly a historic moment in the history of the United States Navy, because by demonstrating the capability of doing side-by-side refueling, you're also demonstrating the capability of conducting sustained operations at sea without requiring access to a port ashore. And of course, by the time the end of the year, 1917, the American fleet is filtering into European waters and actually joining the Royal Navy, the Grand Fleet, as the destroyer flotilla out of Queenstown and then Battleship Division 9 are actually amalgamating into the British forces. And that's the first time in the history of the United States Navy that we're conducting combined operations. And in all respects, Admiral Sims, who became president twice at the Naval War College, is the first American naval officer to hold combined command. And it's all these younger junior officers who are sort of experiencing those lessons learned in the context of war. And here you see Admiral Mayo after he arrives in 1918 on board the Pennsylvania, which is also an oil-fired battleship. And Ernest King, he fleeted up from the rank of lieutenant commander to the rank of captain. You can see him sitting to the left next to another future Naval War College president, William Pye, who's also seated to the far left with King on board the Pennsylvania after they arrive. And of course, working with the British influences American perspectives of global naval strategy as well. And it's that First World War experience where the Americans are using oil-fired warships. The British are still using coal-fired warships. And one of the things that Ernest King comes home from that experience with the recognition is that the British are constrained by coal. And what we have to think about in the US Navy is transitioning completely to oil. And of course, the British also face the problem of getting access to oil. This is actually the Sykes-Picot Agreement map that shows how the Europeans divided up what Mahan called the Middle East. And of course, that region is known today as Iraq. And by dividing Iraq the way they did, that's of course the beginning of other troubles that we all are aware of today. So it's coming home from that First World War experience that Admiral Sims and of course the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Roosevelt, said, we need to develop a Navy, not only second to none, but a Navy that can operate in two oceans simultaneously. We need to develop procedures that enable us to conduct operations sustained at sea without refueling. How do we do that? And it's Admiral Sims, when he comes home from the First World War as president of the Naval War College, who creates the historical section at the Naval War College under Dudley Knox and Tracy Barrett Kittredge. And what they're doing is replicating what Sir Julian Corbett had at the Admiralty in London. And what they do is they're studying the orders writing methodology of Nelson. They're studying British procedures for managing global operations. And they're applying those British perspectives to the American concept of global power. And they're doing it basically on the wargaming floors of the Naval War College. Meanwhile, Knox and King and Pye, all proteges of Sims, came up with the Knox-Pye-King report of 1919. And that report is a really important report that says that every American naval officer needs to attend the Naval War College at least twice in their careers, and if possible, up to 3 times. And leading that charge is none other than Ernest King, who graduated from the Naval War College 3 times in his career. First time in 1916 for the staff course, and then again in 1924, and again before he became an admiral. He graduated in 1933, and he wrote this great thesis that I would commend everyone to read, The Influence of a Policy on the Strategy of a War. And if you read that document, you can learn a lot about how King conducted global operations in the Second World War context. And it's at the Naval War College that they're studying those old battles, Trafalgar, the battles of the Civil War. Of course, Jutland looms very, very large in the analysis of wartime lessons for application in future wars. So fleet operations, surface fleet operations, the battleship is all important. But of course, we've got air power happening. Chester Nimitz, being a submariner, recognizes the potential capability of submarines to change the nature of naval strategy. And it's all being fueled by oil. Nimitz and King are on the cutting edge of these new technologies after the First World War. It's King who actually conducts the first submarine group operations off of New London in 1925. Nimitz is also working on diesel technology. He's trying to come up with ways to use snorkel devices long before the Germans ever tried to do that, as they did do in the Second World War. So there's a lot of, heavy thinking happening after the First World War about what the future may hold. And of course, air power. You can see the old Collier Jupiter on the horizon of that picture. That's been transitioned into an aircraft carrier. Among other things, King, as a submarine officer, said that's a specialized duty. And of course, a specialized function such as a submarine officer should have a specialized insignia to wear to show how specialized that they are. And what you see on this slide are actually his drawings that he submitted to the Bureau of Navigation that were ultimately approved for what we now know today as the submarine officer's insignia. So it's Ernest King who influences a lot of those innovations. And at the age of 49, he volunteered to become a naval aviator. And he's learning how to fly in order to command aircraft carriers, which he ended up doing during the interwar period, 1930s. He was the skipper of the Lexington. And of course, those younger pilots, those aviators at his feet are the same aviators who would go on to command task groups and aircraft carrier forces in the Great Pacific War of the Second World War. And so, by having that diverse experience from coal-fired battleships to oil-fired destroyers to oil-fired battleships to submarines and aviation, that seasoning over a long career, here he is at 49 years old, approved as a naval aviator. After that long career, he's bringing all that experience to bear in those fleet exercises of the interwar period. And of course, during the 1932 and 1938 fleet problems, it's Ernest King with Chester Nimitz conducting those early experiments for attacks on places like Pearl Harbor. So it wasn't Yamamoto who bombed Pearl Harbor the first time. It was Ernest King and others during those fleet problems who demonstrated the capacity of aircraft carriers to attack fixed naval bases. And of course, that's going back to the lessons learned of the First World War and recognizing the vulnerability of the British Empire with all their naval bases around the world. It's also King and Nimitz during those fleet problems who are experimenting again with that side-by-side refueling. Nimitz is actually taking it a step farther. During a 1939 fleet problem, Nimitz did side-by-side refueling, but at the same time, while two ships are refueling side-by-side, he had ships ahead and behind the refueling ship. So you had 4 ships orbiting the refueling ship, which is really crazy. But they ended up doing it. And by demonstrating that capacity to do refueling simultaneously, they're really preparing themselves for things to come. And of course, we all know about what happened in 1941, December 7th, the date which will live in infamy. Thankfully, our Navy had officers in the ranks like Ernest J. King and Chester Nimitz, who in their long careers of beyond 50 years service were able to draw from the seasoning that they had from those long experiences in both peace and war. And they were able to come together and figure out how to win in the Second World War context. And one of the things that I would argue is it's not the training that they got, it's the long years of sustained experience in the ranks of the service in both peace and war that enable these officers to be prepared for that global war at sea. And it's Ernest King who's running that global war, working with the British, working with the French, working with all the other allies to get synthesis in global strategy. And at least out in the Pacific, it's Chester Nimitz who's implementing King's vision for strategy. And one of the key factors in American operations in the global war at sea is logistical sustainment involving oil refueling. And it was Ernest King and Chester Nimitz who came up with the tactics, techniques, and procedures before the Second World War, as far back as 1914, that enabled us to conduct the Second World War the way we did and get the troops and the goods where they needed to be. This one of my favorite pictures. I always show it. This is actually Mogmog out in Ulithi Atoll in 1944. Those guys sitting on the beach, probably drinking a Schlitz on the beach after many, many combat experiences in the Pacific, are able to do that because of logistics. And those aircraft carriers on the horizon were not built when Pearl Harbor was struck in 1941. So think about the logistics planning that went into building that U.S. Navy, King's Navy, second to none of the Second World War. It didn't just happen overnight, but it happened overnight in many respects because of the education that those junior officers received, not only within the practical ranks of the service, but also while attending the Naval War College. And I can tell you from my own personal experience that the procedures that King and Nimitz executed back as far back as 1914, 1917 in combat are still exactly the way that the United States Navy still conducts operations sustainment at sea involving oil-fired ships. That's me on the old Clackering, one of the best ships in the Navy. And it's all because of those junior officers of 100 years ago. And with that, the trick question is, what is this title slide all about?
David, thank you very much.
Sure.
A terrific presentation. As a career surface warfare officer, it's a fascinating brief. It brings home many issues, I guess, things that I had to wrestle with in command of ships, and as a surface warfare officer, spent 32 years at sea on ships. Logistics obviously remains a critical component of sustained operations, as you said, sustained combat operations. So I know, as I had sister ship there as Clackamas is Carr, and we deployed to the Western Gulf of Guinea, and oilers don't get down there that often, so you're constantly reconfiguring your plant. You're trying to find the most conserved, you want to conserve as much fuel as you can, your best engineering lineup to achieve that. But the other thing is just the day and night underway replenishment and refueling at sea operations. I'm not sure exactly when they did the first nighttime refueling operations. I don't know, maybe I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, so they did do experimental non-combat conditions refueling off the coast of California during the Second World War. But there was a lot of hesitation at doing that, especially in combat. They did try to develop those procedures and execute them in the context of the Second World War, but that was deemed too dangerous in combat operations. They did, after the war, develop those procedures in conjunction with the Royal Navy, and off Korea, they were doing nighttime refueling operations. But again, that was always something that everybody had a lot of trepidation about executing at nighttime. And of course, even to this day, we don't like to do it.
No, they say that, for aircraft, obviously at night, combat operations, whatever pilots might get themselves involved to, the most stressful is obviously coming back to the aircraft carrier to land, particularly at night. In my experience, the most challenging thing was an underway replenishment. I mean, I could do anything at sea, but bringing the ship alongside, unless you're in a sailboat and you're jockeying for position to get right at the start line, ships should not come that close together just naturally. And unfortunately, it depends how you look at it. Frigate, I had to do it often. I even refueled going across the pond with USS Kearsarge, came alongside USS Kearsarge, and you come alongside a big flat piece of steel. There's not a lot to take bearings on, but it was exciting. We've got 20 minutes left for questions, so I'd like to, make sure that the audience and our guests know that they can text in a question if you have something that you'd like David to respond to. I did get a first response here from Paul Ling to answer your challenge, David, and the response was oil sheen on water.
Exactly correct. So congratulations to the one who won the contest. That is oil on water. And I kind of wrestled with using this image as a title slide, but I figured it would be fun to show. But I usually like to show this image because to me, this image demonstrates what you need to be able to do in order to win a global war at sea within the context of a conflict where the enemy really has the geographic advantage. So Ulithi Atoll, for those who don't know, is all the way out on the other side of the Pacific. And one of the lead planning officers on Ernest King's staff, as a measure of logistical sustainment requirements to sustain those operations, Commodore Paul Peel said that every sailor in the Pacific, we have to schedule at least one case of beer for each sailor. And that was his challenge to the staff, to plan the logistics required, not only to get that case of beer out there, but also the ammunition and supplies that were required to sustain those operations on the other side of the Pacific. And, contemporary logistical planners today, if they were told, yeah, you still have to get all those goods and supplies over there, but also every sailor gets a case of beer, I think your contemporary logistician would be ripping their hair out trying to figure out how to accommodate that requirement. But they were able to do it in the Second World War.
Yeah. So not a specific question, but maybe just a request. Can David talk about relationships, those forged at sea and at the Naval War College, and how they influence innovation?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great question. Of course, service at sea is a special experience for anybody who's endured that or enjoyed that. I chose to enjoy being at sea, but some people doesn't work for some people. To me, the shipmates that I was able to serve with remain shipmates to this day, and those I've served with at sea and ashore remain dear, close friends. And that bond is a unique bond, and that bond is something that I tried to very quickly. I know I hit the audience with a lot of information, but one of the big takeaways today would be those close connections between those personalities that date back to the dawn of the 20th century are what enabled us to do what is depicted on this picture, to get guys on the beach on the other side of the planet in the Second World War. You wouldn't have been able to do this at the dawn of the 20th century when Teddy Roosevelt was president. You wouldn't have been able to do it even in the First World War, but it was those experiences of the First World War, the transition from coal to oil, the introduction of wireless communications, the introduction of combined strategy. We didn't think about those things before the First World War. And it was that experience that informed how the five-star thinkers of the Second World War conducted those operations. King and Nimitz, of course, are widely known. Another close associate who we all know is Bill Halsey, who was also part of the Sims destroyer flotilla back in 1915. So he and King were out there operating their destroyers as skippers, junior officers. And it's those bonds that you see manifest in strategic terms as being very, very crucial to the American operations of the Second World War in both the Pacific, Atlantic, and as well as the Indian Ocean. Naval War College is central to all that. Of the 78 admirals who were on active service in 1941, only one was not a graduate of the Naval War College. So that demonstrates the importance of the Naval War College education in creating the flag officers that we all know so well from the Second World War.
Thank you. From Victor Sussman, can you comment on how Nimitz, King, and others responded to setbacks they encountered while driving the technological revolution for the Navy at the start of the last century, and how that might inform overcoming challenges to developing the future fleet in this century?
Yeah, that is a great question. Due to time, I didn't really wax too poetic about the friction between senior officers and junior officers. Senior officers in the age of Commander King and Commander Nimitz, when they're junior to those admirals in the First World War timeframe were very, very reluctant to experiment with new ideas. And so it's within the ranks of the destroyer flotilla under Sims that these ideas of oil refueling, using wireless communications to coordinate tactical maneuver, that's all being done in the smaller destroyers that are skippered by lieutenants and lieutenants commander, developing those tactics, techniques, and procedures in those smaller ships that, of course, later on becomes the foundation for doctrine in the fleet, in the battleship fleet. And that process continues into the interwar period when submarines and aircraft carriers are also being introduced into the fleet. And we all know about the widely mythologized gun club, the Battleship Gun Club, that resisted aircraft carriers and submarines. And it's these junior officers who are really pushing that doctrinal envelope, and they're not accepting doctrinal routine as the answer. And they're pushing forward, often despite the senior leadership in the U.S. Navy.
That's spectacular. I mean, great questions. I'm glad you have to respond. So, from Sandra Adams, how long did it take the U.S. Navy to convert from coal to an oil fleet? And also, how do you apply this important historical perspective to how the Navy should seriously face its conversion from its current oil-filled ships today?
Great question. As far as the future is concerned, as a historian, my default response is the future is yet to be written. So by understanding this history, by understanding how the U.S. Navy made these transitions really rapidly, by comparison with other fleets of the world, the United States Navy transitioned from sail to steam very quickly. They transitioned from wooden ships to steel ships very quickly after the Civil War. And of course, the transition from coal to oil is also fraught because you have coal barons who want to keep the monopoly on coal, who are double dipping into the oil fields as they see the Navy transitioning. You see a lot of the coal barons quickly investing in oil. And one of the stories that I have from the Admiral Sims papers is during the big battleship conference that was held at the Naval War College, in the general boardroom of the Naval War College under the Mahan Rotunda in 1908. President Roosevelt was listening to all the different arguments. Stay with coal, transition to oil. Sims was saying transition to oil. And in 1908, President Roosevelt, according to Sims, said, I'm not going to make a decision here in the general boardroom of the Naval War College today. So I'll give you that decision later. And according to Sims, as Teddy Roosevelt was walking out of the general boardroom at the Naval War College, he said to Commander Sims, "Look, if I was you, I would invest in Standard Oil." So that decision was made here in Newport to transition the fleet from coal to oil. That's a major decision. It took about 8 years to build the battleship Nevada as a prototype of oil-fired battleships, but you already have submarines and destroyers that are using oil. So it's those smaller vessels that become the sort of experiment platforms for developing the tactics, techniques, and procedures, but also the technological means to build bigger ships that are fired by oil. So I guess to answer this question, it's something that I'm channeling the ghost of Dudley Knox when I say this. Dudley Knox said that his best command was his first command. He was the commodore of a fleet of tugboats during the Spanish-American War. And it's those smaller vessels that enabled a past midshipman to call himself a commodore and actually have command at the earliest possible time in his career. And I think that's something that the U.S. Navy should consider for the future, give opportunities to the lowest possible level for command so that they can refine their approach to the question of command, notwithstanding the questions of technology and seniority. Command is something that can be learned, but it's also something that has to be experienced in order to master the art of command.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. From James McDonald, I have the impression King was an Anglophobe. Is this true? If so, how did it develop?
So in my forthcoming book, King's Navy, I completely refute that portrayal of Ernest King, which comes out of Tom Buell's biography of King, Master of Sea Power. Ernest King was actually an Anglophile. One of his closest friends was Dudley Pound, who of course was the first Sea Lord in the Second World War. He developed a very close personal friendship with many, many British naval and military army officers. And it's those friendships that really manifest in the context of the Combined Chiefs of Staff. Everybody understood that Ernest King was one of the most capable naval officers. And they also knew that he wouldn't speak unless he believed that it was true. He wouldn't hedge his words in any way. But the portrayal of King as an Anglophobe really comes out of the post-war historiography. And a lot of it is coming out of British histories, portraying King as an Anglophobe, being totally recalcitrant and unwilling to accept the British point of view. I think it's an oversimplification of a very complicated person. And one of the things that I'm arguing in my forthcoming book is that King learned from his First World War experience the vulnerability of empire, the vulnerability of the British Empire in particular, and the potential role of American sea power. And oil is a large part of that discussion. And I would say that Ernie King is somebody who's not only fascinating, but he's also almost a reflection, a personal reflection of that Navy that developed over the period of the first 50 years of the 20th century. And through the examples of people like King or Nimitz, to much an same extent, Halsey, you can get a perspective on what you need to do in order to develop that Navy second to none, but also you can get a perspective on how to sustain the American Navy of the 21st century. Because I would argue that the way that we operate in the 21st century is slightly more managed than it was in King's time.
Outstanding. Thank you again for that response. And it looks like we have about 5 minutes left. Charles Garvarak, I'm sorry if I pronounced that, or Garvarik, thank you for your good report on Admiral King. His performance in standing up an ASW capability in World War II was a long time coming. Have you found any reason for that lapse?
So King also gets short-shrifted on the question of Operation Drumbeat. in 1942. Of course, between January and August of 1942, an estimated 630 odd ships, merchant ships primarily, are sunk within 12 nautical miles of the American coast between New York and Miami. So that's a pretty tremendous number. And King gets blamed for a lot of that. That's an unfair, it's unfair to blame King for all of that, because as early as his time on the General Board of the Navy in 1939, he was arguing that we need to develop convoy procedures. We need to build escorts that are capable of ASW. We need to have integrated air cover in order to conduct convoy and ASW operations. And of course, nobody anticipated Pearl Harbor the way that unfolded. Nobody actually anticipated the attack on Pearl Harbor. And the US Navy had already been engaged in a quasi-war in the Atlantic. We can't forget that Ernie King was in command as the Atlantic Fleet Commander on Halloween night, 1941, when the good old Reuben James went down, when a German submarine sank it. King was in command. He knew what the submarine threat was. He, of course, had served in submarines. He also knew the limitations of German submarines. So he had to make calculated risks within the contexts of post-Pearl Harbor reorganization. Second of all, he was facing a very strong resistance from the War Department to release land-based aircraft to support anti-submarine operations. And of course, Army Air Force pilots were not trained in anti-submarine warfare, and so it doesn't work out real well. The other thing is there's a divided command within the U.S. Navy. Harold Stark remained the Chief of Naval Operations until March of 1942. King was this thing called the Sincus. He changed the name after Pearl Harbor. He said, I don't want to be called Sincus, Commander-in-Chief U.S. Fleet. He said, you can call me Cominch. And so it's those problems of command that have to get worked out, and it's very hard work within the context of those early attacks along the American coast in the spring and summer of 1942. And much to King's credit and also George Marshall's credit, they were able to figure out how to get the job done while still conducting offensive operations in the Pacific. The Doolittle raid happens. Those early strikes out in the Marshall Islands are happening simultaneous with planning for North Africa and other offensive operations in Europe. And they're all doing this by drawing from their long experience in both peace and war, and they're applying that experience in the context of those early combat operations. But it's easy to look in hindsight and say, well, they should have done this and that and the other thing. But it's hard to be too judgmental on people if you're looking at it through their eyes in the context of the circumstances that they were operating in that particular time frame.
David, thank you very much. A spectacular presentation. I know we're going to get you back here in a few more weeks, and you have been a dear friend of the foundation, and I really can't get enough for everything that you're doing and the content you're providing us that we can share with our guests and our members. I know they certainly value it, and I know that you've never hesitated to jump on a VIP tour visit or a quick speaking engagement at the college. So thank you very much for that. Ladies and gentlemen, that basically concludes the presentation for this evening. Thank you for joining us again. Thank you for your continued support and philanthropy for the college and the foundation. I invite you to join us at our next Newport Lecture Series presentation. Will be by Dr. Lyle Goldstein on September 30th. Please, if you haven't looked at our website recently, nwcfoundation.org, please pay us a visit. You could learn more about our rebranding effort. And certainly we would love to have you follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. We want to grow our social media presence, and we certainly want to stay connected with all of our wonderful members and guests. Thank you very much, David. Thank you, and good night. Have a wonderful evening.